Okay, were you watching ABC News Live yesterday? A historic moment, the first televised hearings in the impeachment probe of President Trump. The House starting with 2 witnesses to make the case to the American public that the president may have abused his power for political gain. So here are some of the highlights.
A member of my staff told me of events that occurred on July 26. While Ambassador Volker and I visited the front, this member of my staff accompanied Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Sondland met with Mr. Yermak. Following that meeting, in the presence of my staff at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv. The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward.
Ambassador, you weren't on the call, were you? You didn't listen on President Trump's call and President Zelensky's call?
I did not.
You've never talked with Chief of Staff Mulvaney?
I never did.
You never met the president?
That's correct.
You had 3 meetings again with Zelensky and it didn't come up.
And 2 of those they had never heard about as far as I know.
And President
there was no reason for it to
President
come up.
Zelensky never made an announcement. This is what I can't believe. And you're their star witness. Now, there is one witness that they won't bring in front of us. They won't bring in front of the American people. And that's the guy who started it all, the whistleblower.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you. I say to my colleague, I'd be glad to have the person who started it all come in and testify. President Trump is welcome to take a seat right there.
Was Mr. Giuliani promoting U.S. national interests or policy in Ukraine, Ambassador?
I don't think so, ma'am.
Mr. Kent?
No, he was not.
What interests do you believe he was promoting, Mr. Kent?
I believe he was looking to dig up political dirt against a potential rival in the next election cycle.
Ambassador Taylor? What interests do you believe he was promoting?
I agree with Mr. Kent.
All right, so I want to bring in our political team on the ground in D.C. to discuss how all of this went down. We have Karen Travers at the White House, Catherine Faulders on Capitol Hill, and our senior national correspondent, Terry Moran. And Terry, I want to start with you. Obviously, if you're doing public hearings for the first time, you want the witnesses to be strong. What did you think of Ambassador Taylor and George Kent?
Well, you can see why the Democrats started with these witnesses, Kimberly. These are 2 men who have dedicated their lives to public service, to service of our country through Republican and Democratic administrations. Ambassador Taylor, a Vietnam War veteran, he volunteered out of West Point at the height of the Vietnam War. So these are people whose integrity, whose patriotism is unquestionable. And they told a very cogent, a very forceful story of their alarm, of their concern about how Ukraine was being handled under this president, how, in the words of Ambassador Taylor, he began to believe there was an irregular channel of foreign policy, a shadow foreign policy led by Rudy Giuliani, and they did offer some evidence around that. I would also say, however, that the Republicans feel like they made gains yesterday. They believe that they showed, as we just heard in that clip, that these are not men, for all their patriotism and service and dedication, who have firsthand knowledge of the president's actions. This is the impeachment of the President of the United States. And I think the Republicans got out into the national discussion that this is a question of hearsay evidence. Now, it is strong and leads in certain directions, but at the end of the day, I think both sides came away saying, you know, we got something out of these witnesses.
All right, and Catherine, you were actually there. What was the scene like in that room and on the Hill yesterday?
Yeah, Kimberly, well, I think the main difference here, obviously, is that you get to hear from these witnesses publicly in an open setting. Republicans are making their case, Democrats are making theirs. But what Terry was mentioning really is what we learned a lot more, not only about this shadow foreign policy that Giuliani was essentially running a back channel to, what we learned about as it related to Ukraine, but it paints this broader picture of concern over U.S. foreign policy generally. You heard that from Taylor, you heard that from Kent, and you also there was also revealed that new piece of information, another phone call that Taylor says that one of his aides told him that was overheard. You remember the EU ambassador, Gordon Sondland, while he was talking to the president that day after that phone call on July 25th with the president of Ukraine, the president mentioned investigations again. So that is going to be the main topic of discussion up here this week.
Yeah, and Karen, I want to ask you about that because that was new damning information, this cell phone call between Sondland and Trump. What has the White House said about that call?
Well, the president was asked about this yesterday at his press conference with Turkey's president, and he said he didn't recall that conversation. The president also said he hadn't watched any of the hearings, so it would be not a ridiculous thing for him to say. He's not going to comment on it if he hadn't been tuned in. It was pretty surprising yesterday to hear that the president, during his morning hours, when he is quite an avid consumer of cable television, he said to me in the Oval Office yesterday around noon that he had not watched any bit of that impeachment hearing because he was too busy during meetings. Now, later in the afternoon, the president did have a very packed schedule with Turkey's President Erdogan, so he didn't get a lot of time to catch up. But the White House's two big pushbacks on everything that was said yesterday in that hearing. One, that it's hearsay, that there's nothing directly tying the president to these witnesses. They're admitting they have not had conversations with him. He did not give them any direct orders. And the other is that it's a foreign policy disagreement, that these are unelected bureaucrats who don't agree with what the president wanted to do in Ukraine. The press secretary said last night if they disagree with what the president wants to do, they should just resign.
Yes, and Terry, I just want to get your opinion. How do you think Americans are digesting all of this right now, this first round?
Well, I think they're happy to see the argument and the evidence come to light, and people will make of it what they will. The Democrats are playing a kind of longer game. These are the first witnesses. I think people leaned into them. It didn't really move the needle either way, I think, but they do point the direction to more evidence and testimony to come. And I do think if that evidence is strong, it will change minds. I think what the polls show is that people are following this subject. They're following this story. They want to hear the evidence, and they will have a very high bar before they remove the president of the United States. Americans have never done that. And so it's an uphill fight for Democrats.
And Catherine, just before we go, as Terry said, it continues tomorrow, in fact, another public hearing.
Another public hearing. You'll hear from the ousted ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. In her closed-door deposition, she detailed Rudy Giuliani's back channel, his wanting to get her ousted from that post. And she got emotional at times in that deposition. If you read through it, she had to stop and collect her thoughts. So I think you will see an emotional Yovanovitch tomorrow, and you'll see more details about that specific back channel and her ousting.
All right, Catherine Faulders on Capitol Hill, Karen Travers at the White House, and Terry Moran in our D.C. Bureau. Thank you guys for joining us today. We appreciate it. And you all can keep it here for full coverage of the impeachment hearings, again, starting tomorrow morning. All right, so now we're going to take a quick look at 2020. If you can even believe it, some new contenders joining the presidential race. The latest, former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick. And I want to bring in our political director, Rick Klein, to discuss all of this. Rick, what should we know about him?
Well, he is the former two-term governor of Massachusetts, one of the few Democratic governors in recent decades of that very Democratic state, as it turns out. He has gone on to work for Bain Capital since then, which is a bit controversial in that world. He served in the Justice Department under President Bill Clinton in the 1990s, and he is a very close friend of Barack Obama. They share a lot of the same political advisors and aides, and a lot of folks believe that his election as governor presaged the election of Barack Obama as president just 2 years later.
All right, so obviously he's joining very late. You know, he even called it a Hail Mary. What does that mean when you're joining just months away from the first votes in Iowa?
Hail Mary across 2 football fields, I believe, is what he said. Look,
yes.
you don't get in this late unless you're pretty confident in your own abilities. But that said, a year ago, he was actively planning to run, ultimately pulled the plug on that. A lot of his aides and advisors went on to work for others. And of course, 20-something candidates went on to campaign around the country. So getting in this late, he's in New Hampshire today, neighboring Massachusetts. He's not the only person with some hometown flavor there. Of course, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, also from neighboring states. His strategy, according to the advisors I've talked to, is New Hampshire, New Hampshire, New Hampshire, then Super Tuesday. But already he has missed the filing deadline in 2 of the Super Tuesday states. It is going to be difficult for him to raise the kind of money he needs and to insert himself in the conversation as quickly as he'll need to.
All right. And Rick, you know that I cannot let you leave without us doing a bit of trivia. So you know what it's time for. It's time for Stump Rick Klein. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
All right. So we're talking about the Massachusetts governor. First up, who was the last governor to be elected president?
The last Massachusetts governor to be elected
The
president?
last governor in general, the last governor to be elected
The last
president.
governor would be George W. Bush
Okay.
out of Texas.
All right, very good. And you did get my second question. Who was the last Massachusetts governor to be elected president?
Well, it didn't work for Dukakis. It didn't work for Romney. Kennedy was a senator. Man, I think you're going to have to go back to Calvin Coolidge.
Oh my goodness. You are correct. Rick Klein, this is why you're political director. I love it. Can't stump you. Cannot stump you.
I'm glad I pulled that one out, Kimberly. I needed to resuscitate my image a bit.
Good to see you. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness.
Thanks.
All right. And while all of this was going down, as you guys know, President Trump welcomed President Erdogan of Turkey to the White House. A controversial meeting. As you remember, President Trump gave the green light for Erdogan to invade Syria and go after the Kurds. They're long allies of the U.S. in the fight against ISIS. So I want to bring in Marve Tawi Rolu, Turkey Program Director for PAMED. I probably butchered your last name. I apologize. But, you know, you're as a Turkish national, how did the optics of President Trump and President Erdogan meeting yesterday feel to you?
It looks really bad from both, I think, the U.S. perspective and from the Turkish perspective, because this is a really difficult time in the relationship between Turkey and the U.S. The bilateral relationship is certainly in a crisis. And when we see President Erdogan come to Washington with basically no friends outside of the White House, with only meeting with Trump and very close administration officials, it certainly doesn't look very good. And especially with the coincidence that this visit coincided with the impeachment hearings also added to that negative image.
Yeah, and you just co-wrote an op-ed in Newsweek where you were denouncing Erdogan's repressive domestic policies, and you talked about him silencing media and how Turkey has the most journalists in prison. So along those lines, I want you to listen to kind of a strange moment from a presser yesterday.
A friendly person from Turkey, please. Friendly. Only friendly reporters. We like to see. There aren't too many of them around.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Are they what? Are they PYD and YD?
So you hear that he's asking for a friendly reporter. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, this was one of the most strange moments of that press conference, but we've seen so much like this. I mean, this is effectively how Trump and Erdogan have been handling the Turkey-U.S. bilateral relationship for the past few years, and that's one of the big problems that we're seeing. And this is why it's very important for U.S. policymakers, when they air their concerns with Turkey's foreign policy decisions, such as its recent military incursion into Syria or its purchase of the S-400s from Russia, it's really important that U.S. policymakers, every time they air out these concerns, they also talk about what's going on, the domestic repression in Turkey, because it is very much connected to these foreign policy decisions.
Yeah, so what do you want people to take away from their discussion? You know, you're seeing it in one way. What do you think people should take away from this?
Well, from the meeting is that Erdogan has no friends left in Washington. He is denounced as one of the worst, most oppressive leaders in the world, and that is quite unfortunate given that Turkey is a NATO ally and has been a long-standing democratic ally of the United States. So I think when we see the relationship between President Trump and President Erdogan, we have to put that in that context and see Turkey's drift away from the transatlantic alliance and the increasing isolation of Erdogan in this town, with the exception of his friendship with President Trump in that context too.
All right, Marve, we appreciate your insight. Turkey Program Director from PAMED, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. And guys, we move overseas to Hong Kong. Apocalyptic scenes as the unrest continues. Pro-democracy protesters clashing with police in their fight for autonomy from mainland China. And today, a stunning mix of bricks, Molotov cocktails, and even bow and arrows. Our Ian panel's on the ground with the latest. Ian?
Hey there, Kimberly. Welcome to Hong Kong's Polytechnic University, which is starting to look a little bit like a medieval siege. You can see here, this is one of the front lines of the barricades. There's a big pile of bricks, a homemade wall behind it. You can see there are hundreds and hundreds of protesters there, possibly thousands when you count the people inside. If we slowly come over here, I just want to swing the camera around and show you what the road looks like. Just look at this over here. It's full of thousands of bricks in all directions, again, designed to slow the police down. I don't know if you can make out this clear, shiny liquid on the floor here. This is flammable liquid that's been put there, ready to set alight. And every now and again, you see these spikes here. They're being pushed into rubber tube, again, to try and catch the police out. And everywhere around you, you can hear the sound of construction and deconstruction. Let's try and gingerly go over, being careful about the bricks on the ground here, and see why. Over here is like a homemade factory of defences. Again, it's quite a medieval scene. What they're doing is they're jemmying up parts of what were the sidewalk, these bricks here, like this, and then they're breaking them into ever smaller chunks, and that's because they're going to be used to throw at the police. Now, what they say is they reject the idea that they're the ones resorting to violence. They say it's the police that have used violence. Every now and again, we hear the sound of sirens and wailing, and the crowd suddenly rushes to the front. They say it's the police that use violence in the first place. They're just defending themselves. But I think what we're seeing that's so different right now is that they're ready to stand and fight. And this situation is being repeated at least 3 other major colleges here. Remember, they've got 5 key demands. Above all, police accountability and greater freedom from China. And they're adamant that unless they get their needs met, that their rights are met, then they will carry on protesting. The government is also adamant that they're going to close them down. This is going to go on, but it's also likely to get bloodier. Kimberly?
Thank you, Ian. That's unfortunate. It's been going on for such a long time now. And guys, we're going to talk about a state of emergency in the beautiful Italian city of Venice. Exceptional flooding from high tides, the worst in 50 years, leaving the tourist town basically underwater. And our James Longman is on the ground there. James, have you ever seen anything like this? Can you just tell us what the extent of the damage is?
Hi, Kimberly. No, short answer is I've never seen anything like it. I've been to Venice a number of times and it has flooded, and it does flood regularly, in fact, but this the worst in something like 50 years. I was on St. Mark's Square earlier today and I basically had the water coming up to about here. You can see my boots. I've had a lot of comments on these today, rather fetching. They look a bit redundant now given that the water has receded, but the water will be back later, so it's kind of the eye of the storm at the moment. But some of the pictures we've seen have been absolutely extraordinary. Water flushing through people's homes and their businesses, millions of dollars of damage. We saw in this square itself there was an extraordinary image of an individual swimming in this water. That is a dangerous thing to do. We've heard of deaths. One individual died electrocuted trying to use a water pump, but it was submerged. The water has been so high, 1.8 meters around, that's about 6 foot in fact, that many of the pumps that are situated around this city just didn't work. 85% of the city underwater, and so many of those pumps unable to function. The danger is with repeated flooding in a place like Venice, this beautiful, beautiful city, that the salt from the seawater starts to erode these buildings. You can see that's St. Mark's Basilica behind me. Beautiful, really, really famous building. Now, the crypt was flooded. The building itself does get flooded regularly, but the crypt itself, that doesn't happen so often. And the danger there is if that salt water continues to erode the pillars that keep that building up, well, that really does compromise the structure, and that goes for many, many of the buildings around here. How can Venice stop this from happening in the future? Well, that's the Moses Barrier. It's named after the prophet Moses. The idea is it's to keep seawater out of the lagoon where Venice sits. It's kind of an underwater wall that's supposed to rise up and keep that seawater out when the tide is high, but it doesn't work. They built that back in 2003, where they started building it then, and it still doesn't function. So people in this city are angry, really, that all this talk and really that barrier hasn't functioned. I think about my own city of London. We have the Thames barrier. That works just fine. It's a similar sort of situation. So why can't they get that thing working? People point to corruption, apathy on the part of politicians. That's a problem across Italy. And so I think these images that we've been seeing in Venice are destined to continue year after year after year, as long as they don't get that Moses Barrier working. Kimberly?
Yeah, James, it's surreal to see those buildings in that condition. The mayor says it's from climate change, and also I understand that Venice is sinking a little bit every single year.
Yeah, look, the climate change argument is an interesting one. It's certainly true that global sea levels are rising, but Venice is built on stilts, and on under those stilts, it's basically mud. And there are parts of this city that are sinking. You look at some of the buildings and they're kind of skew-whiff, so the foundations aren't entirely there. But the point is, I think, that these politicians can blame it on climate change, and that gives them the opportunity to really blame it on something which is out of their control. But there is a solution. Whenever you look at the causes for this, there is a solution, and that is the Moses Barrier. If it was working properly, the hope is that it could defend Venice. Now, there is some controversy around that, because environmentalists say, for instance, that if you were to stop the water getting into the lagoon, then it turns the water all stagnant, and that would kill wildlife. It's also not 100% sure if it would entirely stop the tide. But if you just think about other barriers around the world, I mean, the Dutch have engineered around their country to stop water coming closer and closer to land. They've actually managed to take thousands and thousands of tons of earth and put that into the water in order to protect themselves. There are lots of parts of the world which are low-lying, and there are ways of defending yourself. The people of Venice have known about this problem for many, many years, and they're asking their politicians to do something about it.
All right, James Longman, right there on the ground in Venice. Thank you for the updates. We appreciate it. And guys, it's been a long time coming, but Colin Kaepernick might be coming back to the NFL. As you know, he's been out of the league since 2016 and now has a tryout scheduled this Saturday. The league reportedly arranged the private workout in Atlanta, and 10 teams say they plan to send their reps. And although it's been 3 years since he played in the NFL, Kaepernick said on Twitter that he is in shape and ready. All right, but not everyone is quite worried about football. If the state of the world is stressing you out right now, there is nothing a little dancing won't cure. So check out these dads in Philadelphia doing a mean ballet plie with their daughters. And if this doesn't put a smile on your face, I really don't know what will. Check it out.
And plie, and dance plie to your left, plie, time do, arm out,
I love it, and they were amazing, and that is beautiful, just what we need to end all of this. Guys, continue to take care of yourselves, and if you're around, you can stick around for the briefing room at 3:30 p.m. Then you can check out World News Prime at 8 p.m. And if you want to stay updated on all of these headlines, you can go to abcnews.com or download the app. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good day.